And all of our today's speakers on our website. We've got full bios for all the speakers up there if you'd like to learn more about them. And with that, I'll turn it over to Joshua. You know how to switch? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Liz. So today I'm going to be talking about the specific solutions that nature offers us in South Carolina and why science matters. I'm coming at this from the perspective of a hydraulics engineer. I'm a professional engineer. I've been practicing for about 20 years, and I am here as a representative of Robinson Design Engineers. And we are 7 people who are hydrologists, hydraulics engineers, designers, and ecologists. And we work in almost primarily the area of nature-based solutions for projects related to stormwater runoff management, flooding, erosion and sedimentation, and aquatic ecosystems. And so what I'd like to do now is share with you a definition that we've kind of adopted for nature-based solutions, or sort of a few tests or rules that we use in thinking about nature-based solutions. So I don't at all mean to present these as the guiding lights of this whole workshop series, but I instead want to share with you how we've thought about nature-based solutions in our work, specifically with water resources. Now, nature-based solutions can help to address a wide range of environmental and ecological problems, but for the next few minutes, we'll be talking specifically about water. So the first idea, the first sort of guiding light with nature-based solutions is that nature-based solutions give us an opportunity to reclaim as much natural function as possible within the particular constraints of a project or a site, or to address a certain challenge. We want to reclaim as much natural function as we possibly can. And when we do that, we then enhance the system's capacity for self-renewal. Okay, so by reclaiming the natural function, we actually trigger the natural healing process that are inherent to natural systems. Okay, so let's do kind of a thought experiment to test this out. Here's the image we just saw a few moments ago in Liz's presentation of this experimental living shoreline in the Winyah Bay area. So you can see a few key things here. This is a pretty sort of pure green infrastructure nature-based solution where a handful of years ago there was a breakwater built along an eroded shoreline to attract oysters. And you can see clearly what's happened is that by taking this simple act and intervening in this eroded landscape, this small breakwater has attracted oysters, and it's changed the way that water and sediment move in this small area. And so those small changes have had ripple effects, or like a snowball effect, where sediment began to deposit behind the small breakwater. Oysters grew and have colonized this area. And if you look into the background, you see that everywhere there's one of these little breakwaters, you also see accumulating sediment. So in an area that was eroding, now it's accumulating sediment. And that accumulated sediment has been colonized by this cordgrass, Spartina. And so we have reclaimed the natural functions that shorelines naturally provide and oysters naturally provide, which is to slow down the water, to encourage the deposition of sediment instead of the erosion of sediment. And so by unlocking and unleashing those natural processes of water slowing and sediment deposition, the system's capacity for self-renewal has been enhanced. So you can imagine that if we do nothing else here, we walk away, that what's going to happen? The oysters are going to spread, the cordgrass is going to grow more densely, and over a number of years, this system will become even more resilient. And in fact, if this shoreline were subjected to a major tidal surge, say from a tropical storm event, what you might imagine is that even more sediment would deposit. Maybe some of the grass would be disrupted, maybe some oysters would break away, but even in the process of being disrupted, it would continue to heal, and it would propagate kind of this healing process over time. So let's contrast this with our historic, beloved high battery that is really a keystone to historic Charleston. Now the battery serves a few vital functions and has preserved the tip of our historic peninsula for hundreds of years. But the key difference here is that rather than reclaiming any natural function, this particular area actually resists some of the natural function. It breaks the wave action, but it doesn't sort of encourage any deposition of sediment. It certainly doesn't encourage any deposition or growing of any kind of natural systems or oysters. In fact, this area historically, was known as the White Point because it was such a shallow, marshy, oyster-laden zone. And now it's we have been really constantly maintaining this beautiful piece of infrastructure for a few centuries now. And so you can imagine that this particular structure into the future will continue to need a lot of care and maintenance. And we've all committed to continue to care for and maintain this part of our city. But there's a hybrid approach, or there's examples in our community, like at the southern end of Sullivan's Island, where this rock jetty or breakwater was installed years ago. And you can see that on the landward side of this breakwater, Spartina Marsh has colonized this deposit of sediment. But then on the oceanward side of this breakwater is a beach. And so this, I think, is a great example of those conditions where our natural landscape has been so fundamentally altered that we can't just rely on a natural system to heal some of the problems or to provide those solutions. So at the tip of the Sullivan's Island, this was a huge sandbar for a very long time. I mean, British ships got stuck on this sandbar and we bombed the heck out of them. And that's one of the ways that, one of our proud moments in South Carolina history. But now the south tip of Sullivan's Island is subjected to wave action from all of our shipping traffic. And these waves that are being cast from these large shipping containers are, doing the work that typically like a large storm event would do on an ordinary basis. So something that would just happen periodically, maybe seasonally. Now we have waves that are breaking and, pretty often on a weekly basis. Not to mention that the whole sediment dynamics of the harbor and this part of the harbor have fundamentally changed by, the dams that were built in the Midlands and jetties that were built in our shipping channel. So the whole movement of water and sediment is totally different. So in this case, we can't just rely on a small hand-built oyster-based restoration project to do this really heavy work. So what we've done is we've reclaimed some of the natural function and allowed this marsh to recolonize, but the system's capacity for self-renewal has been somewhat compromised, because you can imagine if there were a storm event large enough or a storm surge that displaced some of these large quarry stones, those quarry stones wouldn't magically grow themselves back or put themselves back on the pile in the way that, say, an oyster reef would. An oyster reef, you could imagine if it were dislodged, in a couple of years' time, it could expand and fill in the gaps. Whereas in this case, if this were compromised, it would require human intervention to go kind of put it back to the way it was. This is a good hybrid approach, and this is important to think about with nature-based solutions. That diagram that Liz shared was really helpful to think about the pure sort of conservation, green-oriented nature-based solutions on the one hand, and the pure gray, hard engineered infrastructure on the other hand. So an example I like to think of is, you can imagine that gray infrastructure is kind of like getting a shiny new car, right? And that shiny new car, for the first few weeks, you want to wipe your feet before you get in, because you know that from the moment you drive off the lot, that car is going to continue to decline in value, and it's just going to get dirtier and more broken down over time. It's not going to appreciate. Whereas if you put a new landscape in your yard, you know that you buy these 1-gallon plants at the nursery, you put them in your yard, and you think, in 2 or 3 seasons, this is really going to grow in and be this beautiful landscape. And as it grows in, if you have a drought like we're having now, you think, well, these deeply rooting plants, they've been here for a few years. This drought, they're not going to be in their best shape, but they'll come back. That's going to be fine. That's an example I like to think of something that we kind of use in our kind of everyday circumstances. So, nature-based solutions. We want to reclaim as much natural function as possible, and in so doing, enhance the system's capacity for self-renewal. So, thinking about what the land wants to do, what is this natural function and this built-in inherent desire to heal itself? That can be pretty easy to think about with sentient beings. You can imagine this intelligent red-headed woodpecker wants to tuck away this acorn for a rainy day. It's a little more challenging, though, to think about what does the landscape want to do? What does the water want to do? What does the sediment want to do? What do the plants want to do? Why are they doing what they're doing? And how do we argue with these natural processes? How do we interrupt them, and in what ways can we work in the direction that the landscape is already moving? So let's talk a little bit about just a general view of the landscape, okay? We live here in Charleston in the depositional zone of our southeastern landscape. And this depositional zone means that it was formed by deposited sediment and carbon and shell and rocks and lots of things over many, many years as the Appalachian Mountain Range eroded down. It was once as high as the Himalayas, maybe higher, and now it's grown and created this sort of depositional zone that we live in. So you think of the uplands as sort of the erosional zone, where the landscape erodes very, very slowly over long periods of time. You think of the middle territory, the Piedmont, Midlands, as this transfer zone where water and sediment and carbon-based materials, organic materials, wood gradually moves through the system as the land becomes flatter and lower energy. And then the coast, you have these deltaic regions where things settle out, things like to grow. It's very nutrient-rich, very low energy, very warm temperatures, very humid, as we all enjoyed today for one of the first times. And because of this environment, our water mostly goes back into the atmosphere through evapotranspiration, right? Our landscape takes the water that falls as rain, our natural landscape, sends that water back up into the sky as water vapor. I'll talk more about this later, but our long-term studies in the Francis Marion National Forest going back to the 60s have shown that most years about 75% of the rainfall goes back up into the sky as water vapor. It does not leave through stream flow. So our landscape is this depositional zone that holds water, has saturated ground, and lots of plants because of this nutrient-rich, carbon-rich, water-rich, sediment-rich environment. So here's the fall line across the state. Fall line meaning this place in the southern southeast where there are waterfalls can be found on the rivers. This is the edge of sort of the rock-based geology, to put it simply. Everything from this line out is basically deposited sediment. So the upstate Greenville area has been gradually eroding over a long period of time. Everything in the Columbia zone, we have big confluences of major rivers. Things are flowing through this area. And then you can even just see the flat coastal plain, these 7 marine terraces that have been formed over millennia. And we are right there at the mouth of those. But we have changed some of these processes in some fundamental ways. And I think it's important to remember the context of this flow of water and sediment. We have made some major changes to the way our landscape works. And I want to draw a distinction here between climate change concerns that we all share and are working to solve, and then land use change and human-made change. Most of the changes that we are suffering now are the result of work that our forebears did within the last 100 years. And most of these changes are not related to climate change. This is an 8-mile-long dam that was built across the state in recent memory, in the 40s. There are people who remember this transition happening, and this has interrupted the flow of water from our major river basins, and we diverted one of the largest rivers on the East Coast, the Santee River, diverted it down into the Charleston Harbor, and there were unintended consequences. This was a great civil works project and has done a lot of good things for the state's economy and a lot of bad things for the state's economy. But one of the things it did, the unintended consequence was you take all this sediment-rich, these big rivers that are usually going out in the Santee, you divert them into Charleston, all this silt and clay hits the salt water of the Charleston Harbor and causes sedimentation and siltation. Whoops. And on a smaller scale, in the last couple of decades, we have transformed our coastal landscape into an area where we hold our water using stormwater ponds. And we've got something like 20,000 stormwater ponds in the coastal zone of South Carolina. And now there are emerging studies that show these places are becoming toxic accumulations of microplastics and all sorts of harmful algae blooms that can hurt our pets and even hurt our brains if we have contact in the wrong place and time. And these interruptions require that we do things like dredge our shipping channels and keep our waterways open to the sediment that we've changed its movement around. Because, this Charleston Peninsula that we're sitting on now, the harbor historically from this colonial era map was a very shallow estuary. It was wadable. It's like 6 to 7 feet deep. The main entrance to the harbor was 8 feet deep when Europeans first settled here. We've gradually been changing it and dredging it and keeping it free and open for shipping traffic to improve its function as a harbor, so that now portions of the harbor are 60 feet deep. It went from 6 feet to 60 feet, and that has major changes in the way that our water moves in and out of our harbor. We're seeing major changes in our water levels, which are caused by sea level rise, but also by all the water that we've moved into the harbor from the uplands and the water that we're moving in and out from the ocean much more quickly than before. In areas that have suffered a lot of erosion, if they're left kind of to themselves, like this eroding shoreline on Edisto, and kind of a wild area, what you see is this accumulation of debris. You can see erosion of this bluff, of this hummock island, but then you see accumulation of old trees and logs. And if you look closely enough, you can see oysters starting to recolonize this bank on their own, Spartina beginning to grow in on its own because sediment is redepositing and the landscape is healing itself. In some cases, we can help it along. Another example, living shorelines, where if we didn't act, it would take a very, very long time for this waterway or this shoreline to heal itself. There are no trees around to fall into this particular eroded marsh face and grow oysters. But with a little bit of help, we can have this sort of field of dreams approach. If you build it, they will come, and you see, again, the oysters colonize these simple hand-built interventions, and the Spartina marsh begins to grow back in behind it. But in areas, we have also filled in a lot of the marshy areas of our peninsula. And in some cases, we filled in to build new land. Jared gave a great TED talk about kind of the transforming history, Jared Bramblett in the audience here, that I recommend that you all watch, about how many of the problems of flooding that we have now are areas that we transformed just in recent memory. We fill in low-lying areas, then those low-lying areas flood. We're tempted to think that many of these problems are the effects of climate change, and they are insofar as climate change has exacerbated the problem. But in many cases, nature is just trying to kind of heal itself. Like in this case, you leave an area alone long enough, and it kind of grows back, like Gadsden Creek here against the Ashley River. Areas that were clear-cut since the Civil War have grown back and are now doing that evapotranspirative function of getting rid of 75% of the rainfall through evapotranspiration of water vapor. Our agencies are renewing their relationship with the American beaver and what they're going to do and how we're going to let them live and move in the landscape, and to create pools and ponded areas and oxbows, like these natural landscapes that are endemic to coastal South Carolina. And then in the uplands, in many cases, we've reestablished riparian buffers so that some of these denuded streams in these erosional landscapes, moving up into the landscape, up into South Carolina, have become stable once again. And this is also close to home. This is a stone patio in my yard that really wants to be a field of dandelions. And it really is as simple as this. I mean, there's a desire here that wants to be a field of dandelions. And I am determined that it will not be a field of dandelions. So I'm going to turn to a historic example of something that's happened in recent memory in the ways that humans in a couple generations ago have positively affected the landscape. So I turn to the upstate region, where a few generations of cotton farming and deforestation, actually in reverse order, deforestation, then cotton farming, have created vast areas in the upstate that are gullied. They're called rough gullied land, where there are 10-foot deep or larger gullies where the land has been totally dehydrated by these deep cuts and gouges into the land surface. A lot of these areas have been logged so many times that they don't really have enough organic material left to grow new trees, so these are old hunting preserves or good areas for conservation, and we get to work with some of these areas on occasion. And a few years ago, worked with a graduate student at the College of Charleston to do a study of these landscapes and how we can learn from the way they've healed, or in some cases how they haven't healed. You see downstream of these gullies lots of otherwise healthy streams, except that they're just totally filled with eroded sand and clay. There's no water in the stream, it's just a stream of dirt. It's bad for habitat, but if you move further down the valley into the major rivers, you see that the rivers become choked with this fine-grained sediment in such a way that it smothers aquatic life, but also makes it very difficult to do basic functions like treat water quality for drinking water, because these pieces of sediment have attached to them nutrients and also metals and other water quality constituents that are very hard to remove. A study was done back in the 70s of the erosion that happened during this era in our state, and it may come as a surprise to know that the upstate of South Carolina was once almost 12 inches higher in elevation. Across the upstate, because of this very intensive period of deforestation and cotton farming, the upstate lost, in a lot of areas, over a foot of soil. This heavy erosion that happened just in the beginning of the 20th century. So 100 years ago, this was an active problem. There's newspaper articles about how, what are we going to do? We can't even grow crops anymore. The landscape is so denuded. We've lost all of our topsoil. A more recent study estimates that in this area, if you take the soil that eroded, it makes up a cube of sediment that's 6 miles square. 6 miles by 6 miles by 6 miles. That's how much soil was eroded from the upstate. And that's mostly the organic material that grew trees. And the early European colonists were surprised to see the rivers of the upstate flowing perfectly clear during a rainstorm. Can you imagine the Broad River or the Congaree River flowing clear during a rainstorm now? It's unimaginable, but it's because we had 12 or more inches of rich topsoil that filtered all that water, and also very little of the rainfall was actually made its way to the stream as runoff. It actually soaked in or it went back up into the sky as water vapor. Some images from that time show these deep gashes in the land, and some of the dams that had been built just recently had completely filled in with sediment. Reservoir filled with erosional debris. Pacolet River, 7 miles north of Spartanburg. These disasters were part of they are what generated the Soil Conservation Service, later to become the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS. But during the Civilian Conservation Corps period, the Kings Mountain National Military Park was purchased by a group of federal and state agencies, and most of Kings Mountain Military Park and Kings Mountain State Park looked like this, totally denuded by cotton farming, gashes and gullies everywhere. And the Civilian Conservation Corps came up with a plan. How do we repair this landscape and make it into a park? But mostly, how do we give all these unemployed Americans things to do, semi-unskilled labor? How do we do the work of fixing our country? And this is a hand-drawn map, and if you see these little inverted triangles here, these are erosion control treatments and also field planting of trees. So these erosion control treatments were basically these kind of what we would now call beaver dam analogs. Take some trees. You can see for scale, there's a fellow in the background there standing atop one of these. You basically make a crisscross of logs, put some brush in there, and create a small check dam in the gully, and let the sediment fall in behind it, plant some trees on the banks, and let the landscape heal itself. I took this picture a couple of years ago. This is one of those areas where they use stone. Some areas that were really badly eroded, they used stone. Some areas that weren't so badly eroded, they used logs. Those logs have since deteriorated, but the stone remains. You can see this old quarry stone, and now it's faded into the landscape. These gullies have healed, the trees have returned, and the streams in this area look like something you would call pristine, just in less than 100 years' time. Because by doing those simple interventions, the Civilian Conservation Corps, probably unintentionally, was able to reclaim that natural function of the deposition of sediment and kind of do the work that the beavers would normally have done, and they enhanced the system's capacity for self-renewal. This sort of snowball effect took place. Reclaim as much natural function as possible and enhance the system's capacity for self-renewal. So we've been trying to borrow from some of these ideas, especially with clients who don't have big budgets to do big engineering projects. And by putting in old logs and small stones you can carry in a wheelbarrow to repair eroded gullies. There are a lot of eroded gullies all through the upstate in western North Carolina. A few years ago, we installed some of these by hand to save some old trees that were present. And just soon after we built some of these structures, they was subjected to a 5-inch rain event in a few hours. We were pretty nervous. Are these going to work? And we had gotten a grant to study the movement of water and sediment in this experimental watershed and found that in the 100-acre experimental watershed, the hand-built creek repairs captured 4.5 tons of sediment during a 5-inch storm event. And that sediment would have made its way down into the river system, and we wouldn't have known because it would have just looked just like chocolate milk flowing down. So it does work by enhancing the system's capacity for self-renewal. These fine-grained sediments fill in behind these structures, the vegetation grows, and then it blends into the landscape in a short period of time. Okay, but let's talk about real engineering, right? Because that's all like horticulture stuff. What's that? That was sarcasm. I just want to make sure that's clear. I spent a small fortune in these pads of paper in 6 years of engineering school. And one of the ways we were taught, the engineers among us here today can remember these, trigger warning, should have said, control volumes. One of the ways that we're taught as engineers to solve these big problems is to turn the world into a Lego world, right? Break it up into small parts that we actually can calculate, we can wrap our heads around. We can't wrap our heads around these massive problems, but if we can make a control volume of differential size, where we think about changes in terms of delta X and delta Y and change with respect to time, then that's a problem we can solve, and if we chain all these solutions together, we can solve much bigger problems. So this was hardwired, and this is sort of the fundamental basis of physics-based engineering, problem-solving, differential equations, take big problems and break them into small problems, build on top of each other, and then we can change the world. So if we're taught to think this way long enough, then pretty soon we think that we can manage water with a control volume, right? With structures like this. And these do serve a really important function. Because we can calculate with precision how much water is going to flow across that weir into the box. As long as we know all the driving variables, we can calculate those things. And we can put streams underground in giant pipes because we want to build an interstate over top of the stream, and we can calculate with relative precision how the water flows through these square pipes. How the water flows through a natural channel, years ago, that was pretty tough. Lots of variables, lots of roughness, lots of sediment. It's a little more tricky. But now, we are actually living in quite a different world. I mean, we now have acoustic Doppler current profilers that you can buy on the internet and measure with pretty good degree of accuracy the flow of water in a natural system. Even when I was in graduate school, I'd have loved to get my hands on one of these things. It costs as much as a car, and now they're much easier to get our hands on, and we have the computing power to take these data, calibrate models, and have a much better understanding of how the natural world works. We can take LiDAR, basically surveys shot from space to look at and understand and model the way that rivers work, and then to create future scenarios that we can't really measure to experiment with how things might work, as, for example, under a large flood. And so an example of how we can use the best of engineering and science and the best of sort of traditional nature-based technologies, Columbia has been doing a lot of good work experimenting with this, especially since the major floods, 2015. This is in a neighborhood of Columbia, and you can see here clearly the folks who built this neighborhood never thought water could get this high. The calculations said that water couldn't get this high back then in this era. But a lot of Columbia, like most of our urban areas of the state, have been transformed into these very developed areas where the rainfall and runoff patterns have totally changed. And Columbia is particularly sensitive to this because most of the land is sandy, rolling hills, basically beach sand. So if you pave on top of the beach sand, the landscape becomes much flashier in terms of its runoff, and so the river bottoms don't have the capacity to hold the water. And so we've had to, in working in Columbia, had to sometimes create very engineered systems to just convey stormwater runoff. This is not at all like the natural systems of logs and beavers and all this stuff. This is quarry stone lining a channel, and to make sure that we can have the erosion resistance and the hydraulic capacity to carry the flows that we need to flow through this new 20-acre city park and to protect infrastructure that's in the ground nearby. But this same area, a few years later, when combined with nature-based solutions, can become a wetland meadow. So this is the same place that includes very rigorous engineered system to convey water, and then layered on top of it, a nature-based solution of a wetland meadow to unlock the capacity for evapotranspiration and erosion control. And what makes that possible is the fact that there are a series of large pipes flowing parallel to this creek. So these are 7-foot diameter pipes big enough to drive a truck through. You can see the truck there, top right corner. No trucks were driven through these pipes that I'm aware of, but they could fit, is the point I'm trying to make. But the Columbia landscape has changed so much that it would be almost impossible to create a small stream in a park that was big enough to hold floodwaters. It would just be a giant gully of a landscape. But by using the traditional gray infrastructure like these pipes that were put in place 70 years ago, we can keep the pipes in place to convey the floodwaters when they come, and we can build a rigorously concrete engineered structure that we can calculate like weirs so that during small storms, water can go into this little opening into the natural creek, which you can see here. But during big storms, water goes over this weir, over this little dam, back into the big pipes. So we get the best of both worlds, right? The heavy, rigorous engineered infrastructure and the nature-based solution on top of that. And that idea has spread within the city of Columbia. Here's Hyatt Park just down the road in the same watershed of Smith Branch, where you see these concrete catch basin lids here. That's the top of a pipe that contained another small tributary of Smith Branch for many years. But because in part the successes at the other park and also the grants for water quality and also because of the flooding that happened in the city and just the energy around finding ways to address flooding that didn't involve spending huge amounts of money on huge infrastructure that we had to continue to maintain, that area was transformed into an open channel, daylighted stream within the middle of a historic city park. And this, you can imagine, is just going to continue to get better with time. Now, we had to put some engineering infrastructure in place to hold water and change grades, but we were able to do so in a playful way because it is a park. This is my colleague Phil making sure this really cool concrete wall functions properly. But downstream of this, it allows us to have a more natural area within the same park where we have a small stream, planted lots of trees, and even we're able to experiment with some more kind of wild areas. And you can imagine over time, this is going to grow and evolve. Sediment's going to deposit. Leaves are going to get packed in behind these woody structures. New trees are going to grow, and this becomes a great habitat. And it does things that we can't really predict. And that's kind of the fun part. This is an area where a city is comfortable letting it be a little bit unruly. Now, up near basketball courts, we want it to do what we want it to do, right? But in areas where we can unlock more natural function, we can let that natural function kind of have its way. By reclaiming the natural function, as much of it as possible, we can then enhance the system's capacity for self-renewal. Even after a big flood, it can heal itself and continue to do the work. And then another example closer to home for us, the city of Conway, during Hurricane Florence was flooded to levels that were thought to be impossible. Again, it's not supposed to flood this much. And so the city, working with FEMA money, working with the Nature Conservancy, was able to envision this nature-based solutions to reduce flood impacts where they could take FEMA money to buy out homes that had been perpetually flooded and then create new community assets in the form of ecological parks and then generate ecological benefits from those projects. So here's a rendering of what we hope to be able to achieve there one day, to have a new park that holds a tremendous amount of water in an area where we know the water wants to be, an area where houses have been repetitively flooded. So let's work with the natural system. And this was all somewhat predictable because even 40 years ago, an Army Corps of Engineers study of the watershed said that the major cause of the existing flooding problem is a result of changes in the use of land resources within the basin. And that's because the watershed draining down into Conway is this huge area that's filled with bottomland hardwood forests. Those bottomland hardwood forests are very good for turning into paper if you cut all the trees down. So an area that looked like this and used a lot of the water, 75% of the rainfall was converted back into water vapor. If you clear cut it, guess where all that 75% of water goes? It turns into runoff and it goes downstream. And in this case, downstream happened to be Conway. And those are really big problems that are very hard to address, and I don't mean to propose specific solutions to those main problems here, but I do think that the examples from the upstate just a few generations ago give us hope, and the work that I just was able to share from the city of Columbia and some projects you'll hear from other folks here today. We do see in areas, if we can capture as much natural function as possible, then we can begin to reclaim those processes and we can enhance that capacity for self-renewal. Because the way of thinking that we use to create these problems, in most cases, is not going to get us out of those problems, right? So here's a really simple example. This is an office park on Johns Island. Rather than putting in a stormwater pond, the owners decided to put in a stormwater bioretention basin. In part because of the really stringent stormwater regulations in this part of Johns Island, but also because they wanted to do something a little different. This is New Leaf Builders. They're building a lot of really energy efficient homes. They wanted to make a statement and actually begin to experiment on their own property. And so this basin captures all the runoff from the parking lot, lets it infiltrate into the sandy soils below, and then when it ponds during a storm event, the trees and the vegetation that's there sends most of that water back up into the sky as water vapor so that this site doesn't discharge any stormwater at all. So this is a small example, but this small example gives us kind of a blueprint for how, if we sort of unlock these natural